Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I wanted to talk about the short stories in A Bad Business. This is a publication by Pushkin Press that just came out earlier this year, so it is a newer translation, but these short stories do exist in other collections. This was actually a read-along that I co-hosted with Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space, Stephanie from Miss Richards Reads, Kate from the Literary Apothecary, and Evie from She Was Only Evie. And we also did a live show discussing all of the short stories in this collection, which I will link to watch in case you're interested in further discussion surrounding that. But today, basically, I wanted to rank the 6 short stories in this collection. So obviously, the title story, A Bad Business, is one of the stories in this collection, along with Conversations in a Graveyard, also known as Bobak, A Meek Creature, The Crocodile, The Heavenly Christmas Tree, and The Peasant Mary, I think. It's not spelled like M-A-R-Y, it's M-A-R-E-Y, so I might be mispronouncing that, but that's kind of how I pronounced it in my head. So that's what we're going for. So I need to say before I do this ranking that this book as a whole was a 5-star book. I loved every single short story in here. There was only one that I was kind of ambivalent about, and it was easy to place that as my bottom one, and then my top story was easy for me to choose which one of these I liked the most as well. But the rest of them, I loved every single one of them. So 5 out of the 6 of these short stories are 5 stars, 5+ stars really. I loved them all. And then one was probably like 3 to 4 stars because the writing was still really good. I just didn't engage with the story itself quite as much. I will be keeping these relatively spoiler free. I mean, some of these short stories are very, very short, and some of them are kind of more novella length. So it's easier to spoil the shorter ones. If you don't want to know anything going in, you may not want to watch this video, but I'm not going to be super specific or give away the ends of the stories. So in the bottom position is The Peasant Mary. This is, I guess, an excerpt from Notes from a Dead House, which is a book that Dostoevsky wrote after he was in a Siberian work camp prison situation. So I guess there's a lot of character sketches in that. I haven't read that one yet, but that's what people said on the live show who had read that book before. So this short story just seemed a bit, I don't know, like the writing was fine, but it was just I just kind of didn't understand why it was there. It's about this young boy and something happens where he gets frayed and he runs to this peasant who is a worker in his father's field, and just their interaction. And it was well written, but it just like seemed out of place compared to the other stories here. And so I just didn't love it. It was fine. It just wasn't meaningful to me. So yeah, don't have a lot to say about that one. The next on this ranking is The Heavenly Christmas Tree, which I believe is the shortest short story in this collection. This follows a young boy who is living with his mother. They're very poor. They're living on the streets, and it's very cold, and it's Christmas time. And on the very first page, he wakes up and realizes that his mother is dead. And so then he goes off and interactions with people and all that kind of stuff. This short story felt very much like a Dickens story, to be honest, in the way that it's tragic and focused on poor orphans in the street kind of a thing, and the class divide and all that kind of stuff. It felt very much like a Charles Dickens story, which is interesting because after reading The Sinner and the Saint earlier this year, Dickens had a huge influence in Russia at the time. So perhaps that's why it felt so reminiscent of that. I still really enjoyed this. This was a 5-star short story. It was very, very sad, but I still enjoyed that one. I feel like a lot of the next 3 are interchangeable, and my opinions might change day to day because I really just loved every second pretty much of reading this book. But for the sake of the argument, question number 4, I'm going to put Conversations in a Graveyard, also known as Bobak. So this is about a man who is a writer and is very critical of society at the time, and he goes out for this walk and he ends up laying down on this bench in a graveyard, and he starts hearing these weird like muffled voices and realizes that people in the graves are talking and communicating with each other, and no one else can hear them, only he is hearing them. And so it's a lot of their interactions, and it's very funny. There's a lot of things about it that are very funny. Kate from the Larry Apothecary compared this short story to scenes in Mulan where the ancestors are chatting before they send off Mushu on his big adventure, and the way that they interact together and stuff. And it is very reminiscent of that, a lot of the same humor and dynamic. And it's just, it was really fun, but it was also just an interesting exploration of life after death, and kind of how death kind of like levels the playing field, that you may have prestige in life, but that really doesn't matter after you die, you know, different things like that. So it was just a very interesting short story, but also really hilarious. Christy has made a short story analysis of this story and also the title story, A Bad Business. I'll link both of those below because she did an amazing job at analyzing them and just picking out all the little things. There's probably a lot more I could say about this story, but because I don't want it to be super spoilery, I'm not going to say that much more. But I just found it to be very humorous, but also very deep in the way that it reflected upon society and life and people's mentality about life and death and life after death. So it was very good. In the number 3 spot is another one that's less funny. I found that 3 of the short stories in this collection were hysterical and I actually laughed out loud. 2 were pretty sad, and then, like I said, The Peasant Mary was just kind of whatever. So this was another one of the sad ones, although it didn't not make me cry or anything, and that's A Meek Creature. So A Meek Creature, we have an introduction from the author first, which is very interesting, but then following that we have this narrative from this man who we quickly realize is most likely a very unreliable narrator, and he seems very narcissistic, and so he ends up convincing this young girl who is in a very, very bad situation to marry him. And so it's kind of following their relationship and the ulterior motives that both of them had, but especially him, because he's trying to paint himself in this wonderful light, like he is her salvation from the situation that she's in. But we can tell that he's not giving us the whole story, and that he's portraying things that she does in a negative light while making excuses for his own poor behavior. And in the beginning of the story, we are hearing this man's thoughts as his wife is dead, which we realize from the author's introduction at the beginning that she's committed suicide. So it's really no surprise how the story ends, but it's still very tragic to see how she got there from this very vivacious girl to someone who just kind of becomes a shell of herself due to the abuse and things that she experiences. So it's very depressing of a story, and so maybe you would think that that would be rated lower for me, but I thought that it was just a really good exploration of the main character, well, the narrator, I should say, his psyche. We're like very much in his head, and so it just reminds me of a lot of other Dostoevsky works in that way, that we just dive really, really deep into human psychology, into how people think, into why they make the decisions that they make, into how they've lied to and deluded themselves to justify their decisions or their behavior. And so I just felt like it was very deep and very well written. And so for that reason, it's number 3 on this list. Number 2 on the list is the story that I'm pretty sure made me laugh the most, and that's The Crocodile. The Crocodile is about a man and his wife and his friend who go to this exhibition where there are some wild animals, and there's a crocodile there. And as the crocodile is there, the wife is like, I don't think that this crocodile is live. He's just laying there. And so her husband basically starts kind of like antagonizing the crocodile to try to make him move. And he moves, so the wife and the friend move on to, like, I think there's like some monkeys and some parrots. So they move on, and then they hear him start screaming, and he's being eaten by the crocodile. But he's fine. He's totally fine. He can still talk. There's not a scratch on him. and he's just living inside this crocodile. So then the friend goes and is trying to talk to people, trying to get help to get his friend out of the crocodile. Then he goes and visits his friend inside the crocodile, interacts with his friend's wife, like, you know, all these different things. So this takes place from the friend's perspective. He is the first person narrator in the story, and just interactions with everyone is just hilarious. It's so funny. This man inside the crocodile, I guess this is potentially a little bit spoilery, but this is like my favorite part of the story, so I have to say it. He goes and visits his friend, and his friend is just like, yeah, I don't really want to leave the crocodile. I want to be put basically in kind of like this terrarium thing in a drawing room, and people will come to see me because I am inside a crocodile, and thus I will be able to speak the truth. And he says something along the lines of like, light and truth will emerge from a crocodile. And it just like, that one line was like probably my favorite line in this entire short story collection. I just thought it was just so funny, people's perspectives on him then being swallowed by a crocodile and how they're going to make their fortune from this and all these things. And the friend is the only one who is like, why am I the only one that wants to get him out of this crocodile? It's really, really funny. Part of the reason why it's not my favorite is, first of all, that the one that's in the #1 spot, I just feel like is more well developed, so I will get to that in just a second. But also, I feel like the crocodile seems a little unfinished. It ends very abruptly. And I had done a little bit of research on the story, mostly because I was trying to figure out exactly if there was a specific person that Dostoevsky was trying to poke fun at with this story, someone who is maybe trying to make their fortune from prison, you know, so to speak. But while I was doing that research, apparently Joseph Frank, who wrote Dostoevsky, A Writer in His Time, which is probably the most, well, definitely the most comprehensive Dostoevsky biography out there, also says that this short story is unfinished, but that Dostoevsky never added anything else to it. He just published it the way that it was. So I don't know. So that kind of, it doesn't really bring it down for me that much because it's still easily a 5-star short story, and I loved it and it made me laugh so much. But I did like a short story just a little bit better than it. So the only short story I haven't mentioned yet, you might have already figured it out because it's the title story, and that's A Bad Business. A Bad Business is amazing. It is the longest one in this entire collection. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's 100 pages long. So out of this tiny little book, it's a good chunk of it. It's probably more considered a novella length than a short story length. But I found it so enjoyable in so many ways. This one had a lot of really great humor to it as well. And that was something I wasn't expecting with the short story collection in general. I was not expecting to laugh out loud. I've read a lot of Dostoevsky works that were funny and I did really enjoy. But this just took it to another level because I'm used to Dostoevsky being a lot more philosophical and having a lot more tragic endings. And while there was some philosophy in this, particularly in the title story, and there was some depressing things in A Meek Creature and The Heavenly Christmas Tree, the overarching theme of this was really defined by its humor for me. And A Bad Business is no exception to that. So it follows this young man. We open on this scene where he is at a dinner party with these two older men, and he's basically talking about his philosophy on the world and how we need to treat our inferiors in the workplace as our equals. And he's going off on these tangents about it and basically feels superior to these gentlemen that he's with because they don't feel the same way that he does. And so he gets all riled up and he leaves. When he leaves the dinner party, his servant who is driving his coach is not there because he has left for some reason, thinking that his boss was gonna be there longer than he was. And so he's like, I'm gonna walk home and that will humiliate him and then I'll show him. So already we're seeing the hypocrisy because he's not being understanding towards this man who had left for a very good reason. And then he ends up walking down the street and seeing this wedding that's going on of one of his inferiors at work that he is in charge of. And so he decides he's going to go to this wedding because it will greatly honor them, that his presence will be there and everything's going to be great. He's already got the scenario completely planned out in his mind, exactly what everyone's going to say, how everything's going to play out. It's going to be amazing, and it's going to be him being benevolent by gracing these poor people with his presence on their wedding day. As you can imagine, things don't exactly unravel the way that he had planned, and that's all I'm going to say in that term. It was so funny. It was so funny, the scrapes that he got himself into, and you're also shaking your head at his hypocrisy. I definitely had some secondhand embarrassment while I was reading this story. I was just like, oh my gosh, how do you not see what is going on? You have no self-awareness at all. And then he ends up having more self-awareness as the story goes on. But this story also made me incredibly introspective, and that is actually why this is easily the #1 spot for me, because I felt like Dostoevsky had more time to explore his ideas because it's longer than the other stories in this collection, which is usually why I'm not as much of a short story person, because I like more time with the characters, more time with the ideas that the author's trying to convey. But Dostoevsky does such a great job in this little story of doing all of that, of establishing the characters, of making you care, of communicating the ideas that he's trying to put forth. And it just made me think to myself, like, we all know people where we can see their hypocrisy in the things that they say, causes that they champion, things that they're passionate about or say that they're passionate about. And then we can see how maybe things in their lives don't quite line up with what they're saying. And it just made me sit there and realize, like, how often have I done that? Because it's easy to point it out in other people, but it's harder to see it in yourself. It's easy for you to feel superior, that you're championing this cause and you're doing the right thing and those people over there aren't, and then you don't realize how that's actually playing out in your life sometimes. Sometimes you're a bit blind to that. And so this story made me very introspective in that way, and that was part of the reason why I enjoyed this one so much. And it was very easily the top story. Like, as much as I enjoyed the other stories in this collection, as much as I laughed at some of the other stories or was moved by some of the other stories, none of them could top that first story for me. So yeah, those are my thoughts on A Bad Business, Essential Stories, put out by Pushkin Press. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear if you read these short stories with us. How would you rank them? This was my first experience with Dostoevsky's short stories. Dostoevsky is one of my favorite authors for sure, and I've read a few of his major novels, but this was his first short stories that I had read, and I'm so happy that I read them, and I love them so much. It makes me want to read more of his short stories. I do have another short story collection of his that I think only has one of the stories in here in that, and I actually think it's The Heavenly Christmas Tree, but I could be wrong. But it makes me want to read more Dostoevsky short stories because I just loved every single second of this book. If you have not read Russian literature before, or you haven't read Dostoevsky before, I think that this is an excellent starting place, because I think that short stories can be less intimidating than a big long work, because a lot of his novels are pretty lengthy and have a lot of characters, and I think that this has a lot less characters to keep track of. Obviously, it's much shorter, and there's a lot less philosophizing that happens in this book than does in his major novels, because usually some of his characters end up going off on these kind of long philosophy tangents, and that was a way that Dostoevsky explored a lot of ideas in his stories, and he does that on a much smaller scale here that I think is a lot less intimidating. So if you are interested in reading Dostoevsky and you haven't before, I think that this is an excellent starting place. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.